January 15th, 1809, the ridge at Cacabelos, Spain. Through the swirling snow, rifleman Thomas Plunkett of the 95th Rifles lay on his back, his boots dug into the frozen earth. Below him, 800 yards down the slope, French cavalry surged forward, led by a general whose elaborate uniform marked him as someone important. Plunkett's Baker rifle, a weapon that separated him from every other soldier in the British Army, rested steady against his boot. He aimed, breathed out, and squeezed the trigger. General Auguste Marie-François Colbert, one of France's finest cavalry commanders, fell dead from his horse. When an aide-de-camp rode forward to help, Plunkett reloaded and shot him too. The French column stopped dead. This wasn't supposed to be possible. French generals didn't die at distances where you couldn't even see their faces clearly, but the mathematics of British rifle technology had just rewritten the rules of Napoleonic warfare. Within 5 years, these green-jacketed riflemen and the revolutionary tactics they pioneered would systematically dismantle French military supremacy in the Iberian Peninsula. This is the story of how British rifles shredded French columns, how accuracy defeated mass, and how a new kind of soldier transformed warfare forever. When Britain landed its expeditionary force in Portugal in August 1808, the French army was the most formidable fighting machine Europe had ever seen. For over a decade, Napoleon's columns had crushed every army they faced. The tactics were brutally simple. Masses of infantry, formed into dense columns sometimes 20 men wide and 30 ranks deep, would march straight at enemy positions behind a screen of skirmishers. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Drummers beat the pas de charge, thousands of boots hammered the ground in unison, and soldiers screamed the Marseillaise as they advanced. Most armies broke before the columns even made contact. The Austrian, Prussian and Russian armies had learned this lesson painfully at Austerlitz, Jena and Eylau. Their linear formations, unable to concentrate enough firepower quickly enough, simply dissolved under the hammer blow of French assault columns backed by massed artillery. But the British brought something different to the Iberian Peninsula. They brought doctrine that emphasized firepower over shock, training that made every soldier a marksman, and weapons that killed at distances the French couldn't imagine. Most importantly, they brought rifles. The Baker rifle, named after its designer Ezekiel Baker, was the first standard-issue rifle in British military history. Unlike the smoothbore Brown Bess musket carried by line infantry, the Baker had 7 grooves cut into its barrel in a quarter turn. These grooves, called rifling, made the bullet spin. A spinning bullet flies straight. While a Brown Bess musket ball might hit a man-sized target at 70 yards if you were lucky, a Baker rifle could reliably kill at 200 yards and, in expert hands, much further. Thomas Plunkett had just proven that at Cacabelos. The rifle came with a cost. Loading it took twice as long as loading a musket. The bullet had to be forced down the rifled barrel, often requiring the rifleman to hammer it with a mallet after a few shots as powder residue built up. This made the Baker rifle completely unsuitable for line infantry, who needed to fire 3 or 4 volleys per minute to generate the wall of lead that stopped enemy attacks. But for skirmishers, soldiers who operated in loose formations ahead of the main army, the rifle was a revolution. It turned individual soldiers into precision killers, who could eliminate enemy officers, artillery crews, and opposing skirmishers before they even knew they were in danger. The 95th Rifles, formed in 1800 as the experimental corps of riflemen, was unlike any unit in the British Army. Where other regiments wore red coats and white crossbelts that made them visible targets, the 95th wore dark green jackets with black leather equipment. This was the first attempt at camouflage in British military history, where line infantry moved in rigid formations, firing by battalion volley on command. Riflemen operated in pairs using natural cover, firing independently at targets they chose themselves. The training was revolutionary. Riflemen regularly practiced with live ammunition, something almost unheard of in armies where powder and shot were expensive. They competed in shooting matches with rewards for marksmanship. They were taught to think for themselves, to take initiative, to fight smart rather than simply follow orders. This was radical in an era when most soldiers were drilled until they became automatons who could load and fire by rote while standing shoulder to shoulder with their comrades. The 95th also drew its officers differently. While most British regiments filled their officer ranks through purchase, where wealthy men bought commissions, The rifles promoted more on merit. The result was a more professional, more capable force than the army had ever fielded. But in August 1808, when the first companies of the 95th landed at Mondego Bay in Portugal, they were untested. The French had been fighting continuously since 1792. Their officers and NCOs were veterans of a dozen campaigns. The 95th was about to discover whether their training and their rifles could match Napoleon's best. The answer came on August 15, 1808, at a small village called Abidos. Lieutenant Ralph Bunbury of the 95th Rifles became the first British officer killed in the Peninsular War, but the riflemen he led drove French skirmishers back with aimed fire at ranges the French couldn't match. 2 days later at the Battle of Rolica, companies of the 95th and the 560th, another rifle-armed unit, formed a skirmish screen ahead of Sir Arthur Wellesley's army. When French columns advanced, supported by their own skirmishers, armed with smoothbore muskets, the British riflemen systematically destroyed them. The French skirmishers, trained to advance in loose order and harass enemy formations, suddenly found themselves facing men who could kill them at 200 yards. Every time a French skirmisher raised his musket, a Baker rifle cracked, and he fell. The French were forced to commit entire battalions from their columns just to drive back a few companies of riflemen. This was new. This wasn't supposed to happen. French light infantry had dominated skirmishing in every previous campaign, but they were equipped with the Charleville musket, accurate to perhaps 75 yards on a good day. Against riflemen who could reliably hit at 3 times that distance, they were helpless. The British riflemen had learned their first lesson. They could beat French skirmishers easily. But the real test came at Vimeiro on August 21, 1808, in the first major battle between French columns and British lines in the Peninsular War. Marshal Junot, commanding 13,000 French troops, attacked Wellesley's army of 17,000 British and Portuguese, positioned on a series of ridges around the village of Vimeiro. Junot had fought in Italy, Egypt, and across Europe. He had never lost a battle to British troops. He was supremely confident. That confidence would be his undoing. The first French attack was made by General Thomier's brigade. 2,100 men formed into a dense column, advancing up the slope toward the British positions. Ahead of the column, French skirmishers moved forward, trying to disrupt the British line with harassing fire. They were met by 4 companies of riflemen from the 60th and 95th, perhaps 400 men total. The riflemen were deployed in pairs, using whatever cover the rocky slope provided, firing independently at targets of opportunity. The French skirmishers, outnumbering the British rifles 2 to 1, advanced confidently. Within minutes they were streaming back down the hill. The riflemen were systematically picking them off at ranges where the French couldn't effectively return fire. A French officer reported that his skirmishers were being killed before they could even see the enemy. This was the Baker rifle's first gift to Wellington. It gave him a skirmish screen that couldn't be driven in. The French column pushed forward anyway, the drummers beating the pas de charge, thousands of boots hammering the ground. At 100 yards, the British 50th Regiment, deployed in line 2 men deep behind the crest of the ridge, opened fire. Then something remarkable happened. Several companies of the 50th wheeled forward, moving around the flank of the French column. The column, designed to maximise its striking power in one direction, suddenly had enemy on 3 sides. The British were firing company volleys, not individual shots. A company volley from 60 or 70 muskets, fired at close range into the packed mass of a column, was devastating. Men fell in groups. The front ranks of the column, supposed to deploy into line to match British firepower, couldn't move. They were blocked by their own troops behind them. The French tried to push forward through the storm of lead, but it was impossible. The column shattered. Men threw down their muskets and ran. French artillery crews, advancing with the column, cut the traces of their horses and fled, abandoning 7 guns. This became the pattern. Again and again that morning French columns attacked British positions. Again and again they were shattered. General Charlotte's brigade attacked a position where British troops were hidden behind a ridge crest. Before the French could deploy from column into line, they were hit in the flank by a 2nd British battalion. The devastating volley fire sent them fleeing. Junot committed his grenadier reserve, 4 battalions of his best troops. They were thrown back by concentrated musket fire and then routed by British cavalry. The French lost 1,400 men in the attacks on Vimeiro Hill alone, along with most of their artillery. On the eastern ridge, General Solignac's brigade advanced in 3 columns. Each battalion formed 1 company wide and 8 companies deep. They were met by rifle fire as they climbed, then by artillery fire, then by the massed volleys of British line infantry hidden behind the crest. When the smoke cleared, Solignac's men were running for their lives. General Brenier's brigade, coming late to the battle, enjoyed brief success when they surprised 2 British battalions, but then ran into the 29th Regiment deployed in line. The concentrated firepower of British troops firing by company stopped them cold. By noon, Junot had lost 1,800 men and 14 of his 23 guns. British and Portuguese losses were 1,250. The battle revealed something the French were unwilling to accept. Column versus line, given equal numbers and good defensive ground, wasn't even a contest. The mathematics were brutal. A French column might have a front of 60 men, 3 ranks deep. That's 180 muskets that could fire forward. A British battalion of 600 men, deployed in line 2 ranks deep, put 300 muskets on the firing line. The British had superior firepower, superior visibility, and men who'd been trained to load and fire faster than any army in Europe. A well-drilled British battalion could fire 5 volleys per minute. That's 1,500 bullets in 60 seconds. A French column couldn't deploy into line under that kind of fire, and if it tried to charge through it, the front ranks were simply mowed down. But Vimeiro also revealed something else. The British riflemen had dominated French skirmishers so completely that several French officers mentioned it in their reports. The Green Jackets, as the riflemen were called, had killed French officers and NCOs at distances that seemed impossible. They had disrupted French formations before the main attacks even began. The combination of rifles driving in enemy skirmishers and lines shattering columns became Wellington's formula for victory. But in 1808, this formula required good defensive ground. The British couldn't yet match French manoeuvre warfare on open ground. That would change. Over the winter of 1808 and 1809, while Sir John Moore led the British Army on its fighting retreat to Corunna, the riflemen learned to operate in the most dangerous environment for light infantry covering a retreat. Riflemen fought rearguard actions day after day, holding French pursuit at bay while the main army withdrew. They learned to fall back in pairs, one man firing while the other moved, using terrain to multiply their effectiveness. They learned that a few riflemen in good positions could delay entire battalions. At Cacabelos, Plunkett made his famous shots, killing General Colbert and proving that no French officer was safe even at extreme range. When Moore's army finally reached Corunna and turned to fight on January 16, 1809, the riflemen provided the skirmish screen that held off French attacks, while the army embarked on Royal Navy ships. They were the last men off the beach. In the spring of 1809, Wellesley, now Lord Wellington, returned to Portugal with a new plan. He would build a Portuguese army trained in British methods, establish defensive lines to protect Lisbon, and methodically drive the French from the peninsula. The rifle regiments, expanded now to include the 5 to 60th, and companies of Portuguese caçadores also armed with Baker rifles, would be his eyes, his skirmish screen, and his killing force. The key tactical innovation came from combining rifle companies with light infantry. The Light Division, formed under General Robert Craufurd in 1809, included the 43rd and 52nd Light Infantry, along with the rifle companies. The light infantry regiments were trained in skirmishing and rapid manoeuvre. They could fight in line or loose order. Combined with riflemen, they formed a force that could skirmish forward, fall back, reform, and hit like a sledgehammer, all faster than any unit in Wellington's army. The French were about to learn what this meant. On September 27, 1810, Marshal Massena's army of 65,000 men attacked Wellington's defensive position on the ridge at Busaco. Wellington had 52,000 British and Portuguese troops deployed on a 10-mile ridge that rose to over 500 metres at its highest point. Massena, confident after capturing the border fortresses and driving the British back, ordered frontal assaults by the corps of Marshal Ney and General Reynier. It was a disaster. On the southern part of the ridge, Reynier's corps advanced in massive columns up steep slopes covered in scrub and rocks. Ahead of them went French skirmishers, trying to drive in the British light troops. They were met by Portuguese caçadores and companies from the 95th Rifles. The riflemen, operating in pairs and using The broken ground expertly began killing French skirmishers at 200 yards. The French had to feed entire battalions into the skirmish fight just to make progress. Then the columns hit the ridgetop and discovered British and Portuguese infantry hidden on the reverse slope. The concentrated volley fire at point-blank range was devastating. Merle's division lost 1,250 men. General Foy was wounded. The columns recoiled down the hillside in disorder. On the northern part of the ridge, Marshal Ney launched General Loyson's division, 6,500 men in column, up the road toward a position held by the Light Division. The French were confident. They outnumbered Crowfoot's men and had the momentum of a successful advance. As they climbed, rifle fire began plucking men from the column. Portuguese skirmishers and companies of the 95th were positioned in the rocks along the road, targeting officers and NCOs. General Simon, commanding one of Loyson's brigades, rode forward to personally direct the French skirmishers. He was shot dead. The French skirmishers, unable to drive back riflemen who killed them at 3 times their effective range, fell back into the column. Then French artillery opened up, trying to suppress the British position. But Wellington had placed his troops on the reverse slope, invisible to French gunners. The guns were firing blind, hitting nothing. Loyson's columns pushed on, climbing the steep road, getting closer to what appeared to be a thin British skirmish line. When they were 10 paces away, the 43rd and 52nd Light Infantry stood up from the sunken road where they'd been hidden. 1,750 men in 2 deep line opened fire at point-blank range. The front ranks of both French columns ceased to exist. Then 3 companies from each British regiment wheeled forward, forming a semicircular line around the head of the French formation. The French were taking fire from 3 directions and couldn't deploy. They broke and ran. Loyson lost 1,250 men in minutes. The French tried again. Another column advanced. Again it was shattered by rifle fire during the approach and volleys at the crest. By the end of the day, Messina had lost 4,500 men to Wellington's 1,250. More importantly, French officers began to realise they were fighting an enemy who had solved the column versus line equation. British skirmishers, armed with rifles, couldn't be driven in. British artillery, positioned on reverse slopes, couldn't be suppressed. British infantry, hidden until the last moment, delivered devastating fire at point-blank range. And if the French tried to deploy from column to line under fire, they were simply shot to pieces. A French officer wrote after Busaco that the British skirmishers had caused enormous loss of officers. This wasn't hyperbole. Riflemen were specifically trained to target officers and NCOs first. A French column depended on its officers to maintain cohesion and direct the attack, kill the officers, and the column became a mob. The tactical superiority of British rifle-armed skirmishers over French light infantry was now undeniable. French skirmishers, armed with smoothbore muskets and trained in aggressive forward tactics that had worked against every other European army, were being systematically destroyed by men who could kill them before they could even fire back. The psychological impact was devastating. French light infantry companies began to lose their aggressive edge. Why run forward when invisible riflemen 200 yards away could shoot you dead? But the riflemen were more than just skirmishers. As the war progressed, they proved they could fight in any role. At the sieges of Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz in 1812, rifle companies stormed breaches alongside line infantry, fighting with sword bayonets in brutal close-quarters combat. At Salamanca in 1812, riflemen provided the skirmish screen that allowed Wellington to manoeuvre his army undetected, before launching the devastating attack that shattered Marmont's army. At Vitoria in 1813, companies of the 95th fought in the mountains, in the valleys, and in the city streets, adapting to every tactical situation. Major John Blackiston of the Portuguese Caçadores wrote that he never saw skirmishers like the 95th. They possessed individual boldness, mutual understanding, and quickness of eye in taking advantage of ground that he had never seen equalled. This wasn't just marksmanship, it was tactical intelligence. Riflemen were trained to read terrain, to anticipate enemy movements, to think several moves ahead. They were soldiers who could operate independently, but also coordinate with their comrades instinctively. In March 1810, at the bridge of Barba del Puerco, a single company of the 95th held off an entire French regiment, using the narrow bridge and their rifles' range advantage to create a killing zone that the French couldn't cross. The company fired over 2,000 rounds and inflicted heavy casualties while suffering only 5 wounded themselves. This kind of tactical flexibility was possible because the 95th operated under different disciplinary principles than line regiments. Flogging was rare in the Rifles. Officers ate with their men on campaign. Merit mattered more than birth. The regiment attracted intelligent, resourceful men who could be trusted to think for themselves. This created a culture that was both more professional and more effective than traditional regiments. But the true devastation of British firepower came when rifles and lines worked together. The tactical sequence Wellington perfected went like this. Riflemen would deploy forward as the French advanced, using terrain to maximum advantage. They would begin killing at 200 yards, targeting officers and file closers, the NCOs who kept the column together. As the French got closer, trying to maintain formation under this harassing fire, British artillery would open up with case shot and shrapnel, designed to burst over formations and rain down metal fragments. The French column, now disrupted, bleeding officers, and under artillery fire, would try to deploy into line to match British firepower. But deployment under fire was nearly impossible. It required complex drill movements, officers shouting commands, and space to manoeuvre. The riflemen and artillery gave them none of these things. If the column somehow managed to close to within 100 yards, British line infantry would open fire. A battalion volley from 600 muskets at 100 yards created a wall of lead that nothing could survive. If the French hesitated, the British would fire a second volley. If they tried to charge through, they were met with bayonets by men who had just eviscerated their front ranks. And if they broke and ran, riflemen would pursue them, continuing to kill fleeing soldiers at ranges where return fire was impossible. The casualty ratios tell the story. At Vimeiro, the French lost 1,800 to the British, 1,250. At Busaco, the French lost 4,500 to the British, 1,250. At Salamanca, the French lost 14,000 killed and wounded to the British 5,000. These weren't close-run things. These were one-sided massacres where French tactical doctrine ran headlong into British firepower and simply disintegrated. The rifle was a key component of this system, but it wasn't the only factor. British line infantry were trained to fire faster than anyone in Europe. They practiced battalion drill until movements became instinctive. Their muskets were well maintained, their flints were replaced regularly, and their ammunition was standardized. A British battalion could fire 5 company volleys per minute when needed. That's 2,500 bullets per minute from a 600-man battalion. The French couldn't match this. Their columns depended on momentum and moral effect. When momentum was stopped by firepower and morale was shattered by casualties, the columns broke. French officers began writing about the devastating effect of British musketry. One described it as a wall of lead that made advance impossible. Another wrote that his men reached within 20 paces of the British line before volleys wiped out the front ranks and the column disintegrated. By 1812, French marshals who had fought Wellington in the Peninsula were warning Napoleon that British infantry were different from other armies. They fired faster, they held position under attack, and their skirmishers couldn't be driven in. Napoleon, who had never personally fought the British in a major land battle, dismissed these warnings. He would learn their truth at Waterloo in 1815. But in the Peninsula from 1808 to 1814, the combination of British rifles, lines, and tactics systematically destroyed French tactical superiority. The Green Jackets, as riflemen were called, became the most feared enemy of French light infantry. French officers reported their men were demoralized by fighting an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't hit. The rifle's 200-yard killing range meant riflemen could dominate ground that was impossible for smoothbore muskets. In forests, in mountains, in broken terrain where visibility was limited but cover was abundant, riflemen were virtually unstoppable. At the Battle of Tarbes in March 1814, all 3 battalions of the 95th fought together for the first time, unsupported by other troops. They swept Marshal Soult's forces from Wellington's path in a display of rifle fire that Wellington described as needing no novel proof of its destructive power. This was vindication. The rifles, dismissed by some as too slow to operate alone, had independently defeated a force several times their size through accurate, sustained fire. The French had no answer. Their light infantry couldn't match the rifles' range. Their columns couldn't close under rifle fire combined with line volleys. Their artillery couldn't suppress riflemen using terrain for cover. The tactical dominance was complete, but the rifles had a larger impact than just killing enemy soldiers. They changed how the British Army thought about warfare. The old model of massed formations firing by battalion volley and charging with bayonets didn't disappear, but it was supplemented by light infantry doctrine that emphasized individual skill, tactical flexibility, and precision over mass. After the Peninsular War, the lessons of rifle-armed skirmishers influenced British military thinking for a century. The emphasis on marksmanship, individual initiative, and using terrain intelligently became core to British light infantry training. Units like the Rifle Brigade, as the 95th was renamed in 1816, preserved these traditions and passed them to new generations. The Baker rifle itself served until the 1830s, when it was replaced by more advanced designs. But the principle it embodied, that accuracy mattered as much as rate of fire, that a soldier who could think and shoot straight was worth more than a soldier who simply followed orders, became fundamental to modern infantry doctrine. The French, to their credit, learned from their defeats. After 1815, French military doctrine began emphasizing skirmishers and rifle-armed light infantry. The column attacks that had dominated Napoleonic warfare gave way to more flexible tactics that combined all arms more effectively. But in the Peninsula from 1808 to 1814, French columns learned through bitter experience that charging British positions was suicide. Wellington's formula of rifles, lines, and defensive ground created casualty ratios that made every French victory Pyrrhic and every British victory devastating. Marshal Soult, who fought Wellington from 1809 to 1814, wrote after the war that British infantry were the finest in Europe. He specifically mentioned their riflemen as soldiers who combined marksmanship with tactical intelligence in ways French light infantry couldn't match. This from a man who had led armies to victory across Europe. The respect was earned in blood. French casualty lists from peninsular battles showed disproportionate losses among officers and NCOs. This wasn't coincidence. This was the deliberate effect of riflemen who were trained to kill leaders first. A French battalion that lost its company commanders and sergeants in the approach became a mob of confused soldiers who couldn't execute tactical movements. Wellington understood this. He positioned his riflemen to maximize their impact on French command and control. While line infantry waited behind crests or in sunken roads, riflemen operated forward, identifying and killing anyone who looked like a leader. The effect multiplied over time. French officers began to avoid wearing distinctive uniforms. They stopped riding horses when near British positions. They tried to hide among their men, but the rifleman could spot an officer by his bearing, by how other soldiers looked to him for orders, by 100 tiny cues that marked him as a target. And once spotted, at 200 yards, he was dead. The Baker rifle had another advantage beyond accuracy. It was shorter than the Brown Bess musket, making it easier to handle in rough terrain. The sword bayonet, while controversial among some riflemen who found it too short for prolonged hand-to-hand fighting, gave the weapon reach and made it viable in close combat. The rifle's construction was robust. It could take punishment that would disable more delicate sporting rifles. Riflemen reported weapons that continued to function after being immersed in water, dropped from horses, and fired hundreds of times without cleaning. This reliability was crucial in campaign conditions where weapons maintenance was difficult and ammunition supplies were uncertain. The rifle companies also developed distinctive tactics for different situations. When screening an advancing army, they would leapfrog forward in pairs, one man covering while the other moved. When covering a retreat, they would fall back by sections, each section covering the others. When holding a position, they would use available cover to create overlapping fields of fire that left no dead zones. In sieges, they would provide precision fire to suppress enemy gun crews and snipers. In open battle, they would form on the flanks of line battalions, protecting them from enemy skirmishers. This tactical flexibility made rifle companies invaluable to Wellington. He could use them for almost any mission that required skill and initiative rather than mass and discipline. The Portuguese caçadores, trained by British officers and equipped with Baker rifles, proved that the rifle infantry concept could be exported. Each Portuguese caçador battalion included a company of atiradores, sharpshooters, equipped with rifles. These units performed almost as well as the British rifle, companies, providing Wellington with additional light troops who could match French skirmishers. The King's German Legion, German soldiers in British service, also fielded rifle-armed companies that fought throughout the peninsula. The combination of British, Portuguese and German riflemen gave Wellington a skirmish advantage that the French simply couldn't overcome. By 1813, French light infantry were demoralised by repeated defeats in skirmish actions. They had been outfought so consistently that they began to avoid direct confrontations with rifle companies. This gave Wellington the initiative in the skirmish war that preceded every major battle. He could push his skirmish line forward aggressively, knowing his riflemen would drive in French light troops. This meant Wellington could scout French positions, identify weak points, and position his forces while the French were effectively blind. Information dominance, enabled by rifle-armed skirmishers who could operate forward of the main army with relative impunity, was a strategic advantage that multiplied Wellington's tactical superiority. The numbers, cold and brutal, tell the complete story of British tactical dominance in the Peninsular War. Wellington fought dozens of major and minor actions between 1808 and 1814. In almost every engagement, British casualties were substantially lower than French casualties, often by ratios of 3-1 or better. This wasn't luck. This was the systematic application of firepower, defensive tactics, and rifle-armed skirmishes that made frontal attacks on British positions suicidal. The French tried everything to counter British tactics. They increased the number of their own skirmishers, they tried deploying into line before contact, they attempted flanking manoeuvres, they brought up more artillery, nothing worked. British skirmishers, armed with rifles, simply killed French skirmishers before they could close. British lines, positioned on good ground, delivered firepower that columns couldn't match. British tactical doctrine, refined through 6 years of continuous warfare, had solved the Napoleonic way of war. When Napoleon finally faced Wellington personally at Waterloo in June 1815, he attacked British positions with the same column tactics that had dominated European warfare for 20 years. The result was predictable. French columns climbed the slopes toward British positions, rifle companies and light infantry battalions, deployed forward as skirmishers, began killing at long range. As columns got closer, British line infantry, hidden behind crests or in sunken roads, stood up and fired devastating volleys. Column after column was shattered. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's finest troops, attacked in column late in the day. They too were stopped by British firepower and routed by a bayonet charge. The battle confirmed what Wellington had known since Vimeiro in 1808. Given good ground, British infantry tactics based on rifles, lines, and firepower were superior to French column attacks. Napoleon had been warned by his marshals who fought in the peninsula. He hadn't listened. At Waterloo, he paid the price. The Peninsular War established principles that remained relevant long after smoothbore muskets and flintlock rifles were replaced by breech loaders and magazine-fed weapons. Accurate fire matters more than volume of fire if you can hit what you aim at. Individual soldier skill and initiative matter as much as unit cohesion and discipline. Using terrain to multiply effectiveness is smarter than attacking across open ground. Killing enemy leaders disrupts enemy formations more effectively than killing rank-and-file soldiers. These principles, proven by British riflemen in the mountains of Portugal and Spain, became fundamental to modern infantry doctrine. The Baker rifle itself, though superseded by better weapons, represented a philosophical shift in how armies thought about infantry combat. It proved that investing in weapons that required more skill but delivered better results was worth the trade-off in rate of fire. It showed that soldiers who could think and fight independently were more valuable than automatons who simply followed orders. It demonstrated that accuracy at long range changed the tactical calculus of infantry combat. The 95th Rifles, later renamed the Rifle Brigade, became one of the most decorated regiments in British history. Their battle honours from the Peninsular War read like a gazetteer of Wellington's victories. Roliça, Vimeiro, Corunna, Busaco, Ciudad Rodrigo, Badajoz, Salamanca, Vitoria, the Pyrenees, Nivelle, Nives, Orth, Toulouse, and finally Waterloo. At every battle, the Green Jackets were there, scouting, skirmishing, fighting, dying. They paid a heavy price. Rifle companies, operating forward of the main army, took disproportionate casualties. Officers who led from the front were especially vulnerable, but they killed French soldiers at ratios that justified the losses, and they established a reputation that made French troops hesitate when they saw Green Jackets ahead. That hesitation, that fraction of a second when French skirmishers remembered what happened the last time they faced riflemen, was worth more than numbers. Morale is a weapon, and the 95th had broken French light infantry morale through 6 years of systematically winning every skirmish fight. In the final campaign of 1813 and 1814, as Wellington's army pushed into southern France, French armies were demoralised, outnumbered, and outfought. The rifle-armed skirmishers who had dominated every skirmish action since 1808 now operated with impunity. French light infantry units, once the pride of Napoleon's armies, were shadows of their former effectiveness. They had been beaten too many times by British rifles. The combination of tactical dominance, firepower superiority, and British rifles had shredded French columns so consistently that the mere presence of green jackets ahead of British positions caused French attacks to lose momentum. This psychological dominance, built on thousands of successful skirmish actions and dozens of major battles, was as important as the rifles themselves. The French had learned that attacking British positions meant death. They learned that French columns couldn't break British lines. They learned that their skirmishers would be killed before they could engage British riflemen. These lessons, burned into French tactical consciousness through 6 years of defeat, made every subsequent battle harder for French commanders and easier for Wellington. The story of British rifles in the Peninsular War is ultimately about how technological advantage, tactical innovation, and training created dominance. The Baker rifle was a better weapon than the smoothbore musket for skirmishing, but it required better soldiers to use effectively. The British invested in those soldiers, training them to standards that other armies didn't match. The tactical doctrine that employed riflemen as an advanced screen, protected by line infantry and supported by artillery, maximised their effectiveness and created a system of warfare that French tactical doctrine couldn't overcome. The result was 6 years of almost unbroken success for British arms in the peninsula. Wellington lost engagements, lost positions, and occasionally lost battles, but he never lost a campaign, and by 1814 he had driven the French completely out of Spain and Portugal. The rifles, the green jackets, the soldiers who could hit a man at 200 yards and kill French generals at 800 were a crucial component of that success. In January 1809, Thomas Plunkett had lain in the snow at Cacabelos and killed General Colbert at impossible range. That shot, famous throughout both armies, symbolised what British rifles represented: precision, skill, courage and effectiveness at ranges that seemed impossible. The French had charged into British positions at Vimeiro, confident in their numerical and tactical superiority. By Waterloo they charged reluctantly, knowing they would be shredded. The transformation took 6 years and cost France tens of thousands of casualties. The lesson was learned in the mountains of Portugal, in the hills of Spain, in 100 skirmish actions where green-jacketed riflemen killed French soldiers who never even saw them. British rifles didn't win the Peninsular War alone. Wellington's tactical genius, the steadiness of British line infantry, the improvement of Portuguese forces, Spanish guerrilla warfare and French strategic mistakes all contributed. But the rifles, and the men who carried them, rewrote the rules of infantry combat and proved that accuracy, skill and intelligence could defeat mass, momentum and shock. That lesson echoed through military history long after the last Baker rifle was retired and the last veteran of the 95th had passed away. The green jackets had changed warfare forever, one accurate shot at a time. The mathematics of firepower destruction went deeper than simple casualty counts. Every engagement in the Peninsular War generated data that Wellington's staff officers meticulously recorded. These records, preserved in the British National Archives, reveal patterns that explain why French tactical doctrine failed so completely against British methods. A typical French column attack involved between 1,500 and 3,000 men formed into a rectangular mass. The front might be 60 to 80 men wide, but only the first 2 or 3 ranks could effectively use their muskets. This meant that a 3,000-man column could bring perhaps 200 muskets to bear on targets directly ahead. The remaining troops provided weight for the charge and replacements for casualties in the front ranks. A British battalion of 800 men, deployed in line 2 ranks deep, put 400 muskets on the firing line immediately. Every soldier could see the enemy and fire at them. The firepower ratio favoured the British 2-to-1 before considering rate of fire or accuracy. British line infantry were drilled to fire by company volleys in sequence, creating continuous fire rather than simultaneous battalion volleys that left gaps for enemy movement. A battalion divided into 10 companies could maintain almost continuous fire, with one company shooting every 6 seconds. The effect on an approaching column was devastating. The front ranks faced constant incoming fire from multiple directions if British battalions overlapped their fields of fire. French infantry manuals from the period show that columns were supposed to deploy into line at about 100 yards from the enemy, matching their firepower. But deployment required complex drill movements, clear commands from officers, and crucially, time and space. Under fire from British lines, with officers being killed by riflemen, French columns rarely managed to deploy. They either tried to charge through the fire, which resulted in massacre, or they stopped and tried to return fire from column formation, which was ineffective and resulted in slower massacre. The few times French columns did successfully deploy, British battalions would refuse their flanks, pulling back the edges of their line to create an L shape that caught the French in crossfire. Wellington had studied French tactical doctrine carefully. He understood that columns depended on momentum and shock. Deny them momentum through firepower, and they became helpless. His positioning of troops behind ridge crests or in dead ground, invisible to French observers, meant that column commanders often didn't know they were about to walk into prepared positions until it was too late. At Busaco, French columns climbed for 30 minutes under harassing fire from riflemen, losing officers and cohesion, only to discover British battalions waiting at the crest. The psychological shock of that discovery, combined with immediate volley fire at point-blank range, shattered French morale before the physical damage even registered. This was warfare as much psychological as physical. The riflemen contributed to this psychological warfare in ways that raw statistics couldn't capture. French soldiers knew that men in green jackets could kill them at distances where they couldn't fight back. This knowledge made every advance toward British positions a test of courage. Soldiers would see their comrades fall to invisible riflemen and know they might be next. The stress accumulated over campaigns. Veterans of multiple peninsular battles reported in memoirs that advancing against British positions produced anxiety that wasn't present in battles against other armies. They knew they would take casualties long before they could return fire effectively. They knew their officers would be targeted first, leaving them leaderless at crucial moments. They knew that if they survived the rifle fire and the artillery and reached the British line, they would face volley fire that nothing could survive. This knowledge eroded French offensive capability more surely than any single defeat. By 1812, French infantry in Spain were increasingly reluctant to attack British positions. Marshal Marmont complained that his troops hesitated when ordered to assault prepared British defences. Marshal Soult reported that his men required constant encouragement to advance against Wellington's positions. This wasn't cowardice. These were veterans who had conquered much of Europe, but they had learned through bitter experience that attacking British infantry was suicide. The rifle companies themselves evolved tactically throughout the war. Early doctrine had riflemen operating in pairs, firing and moving independently. By 1810, they were operating in sections of 10 to 15 men, coordinating their fire to suppress specific targets. By 1812, entire companies moved as units, though maintaining loose formations that allowed individual initiative. This evolution reflected increasing tactical sophistication. Riflemen learned to recognize different types of French formations at distance and adjust their tactics accordingly. Against French skirmishers, they would engage in individual marksmanship duels, using their range advantage to drive the enemy back. Against columns, they would concentrate fire on the front ranks and visible officers, disrupting cohesion. Against cavalry, they would form rallying squares around light infantry battalions, using aimed fire to bring down horses and create obstacles. The flexibility was remarkable. A rifle company could transition from extended skirmish line to concentrated fire support to anti-cavalry defence within minutes. This required training, discipline and trust in both individual soldiers and their officers. The 95th developed this through constant drilling and real combat experience. Captain Harry Smith of the 95th, who later became a general, wrote that riflemen were taught to think about why they were doing something, not just how to do it. This pedagogical approach created soldiers who could adapt to unexpected situations without waiting for orders. When Major George Napier was wounded leading his rifle company at Ciudad Rodrigo in 1812, his sergeants immediately took command and continued the assault without missing a step. When Captain Jonathan Leach found his company cut off during a skirmish near Sabugal, he led his men through enemy lines using terrain and darkness, killing French soldiers who got too close with precise aimed fire. These weren't exceptional events. They were routine for the rifle companies. The training and culture created soldiers who were individually dangerous and collectively unstoppable when properly employed. The contrast with French light infantry was stark. French voltigeurs, the light infantry companies in each battalion, were trained in skirmishing but remained tied to their parent units. They couldn't operate independently for extended periods. They lacked the individual marksmanship training that British riflemen received. Most importantly, they were armed with smoothbore muskets that couldn't match rifle range. French attempts to create rifle-armed units failed repeatedly. The French had good rifles, including the Versailles pattern that was actually superior to the Baker in some respects. But they never developed the tactical doctrine or training infrastructure to employ riflemen effectively. French military culture emphasized mass and shock over individual skill. This cultural bias made it difficult to create elite light infantry units that operated on the British model. There were exceptions. Some French light infantry officers developed excellent skirmishing skills and gave British riflemen real fights. But these were individuals, not systematic products of doctrine and training. The broader French army never matched British capabilities in light infantry warfare. This failure cost them dearly throughout the peninsula. Wellington's ability to push his skirmish line forward aggressively, knowing his riflemen would win the light infantry battle, gave him intelligence advantages that multiplied his tactical edge. He could scout French positions, identify weaknesses, and position his forces while French commanders operated partially blind. The siege warfare in the peninsula showcased riflemen in a different role. At Ciudad Rodrigo in January 1812, rifle companies provided precision fire to suppress French gun crews on the walls. Riflemen would position themselves behind cover 300 yards from the fortress and systematically shoot any French soldier who appeared on the ramparts. This forced the French to keep their heads down, reducing their defensive fire during the assaults. When the breaches were stormed, riflemen went in with the assault columns, fighting with sword bayonets in the hand-to-hand combat that characterized breach assaults. At Badajoz in April 1812, the 95th suffered heavy casualties in the desperate fighting at the breaches. But rifle companies also scaled the castle walls using ladders, getting into the fortress and opening gates for the main assault. The versatility was extraordinary. Soldiers trained primarily as marksmen, and skirmishers could transition to close-quarters combat when needed. This reflected both their training and their quality. The 95th attracted intelligent, physically capable men who could master multiple skills. The equipment riflemen carried reflected their specialized role. Each man had his Baker rifle, a sword bayonet, 60 rounds of ammunition in a black leather cartridge box, a powder horn for priming, a bullet mold for casting replacement bullets, spare flints, a greatcoat, a pack with rations and personal items, and a canteen. Total weight was about 60 pounds, less than line infantry who carried more ammunition and longer bayonets. The reduction in weight helped riflemen move faster through rough terrain. The dark green uniform was practical in ways beyond camouflage. It didn't show dirt as much as the red coats of line infantry, important for soldiers who spent time lying in mud and crawling through underbrush. The black leather equipment didn't require the constant cleaning and whitening that white leather crossbelts demanded. Every aspect of rifleman kit was designed for function over appearance. This was revolutionary in an era when armies prized parade ground appearance. The 95th looked unmilitary by traditional standards, but they were supremely functional for their role. Officers of the 95th came from different backgrounds than typical British officers. While many still purchased their commissions, the regiment also promoted from the ranks more frequently than line regiments. This created an officer corps that understood the enlisted experience and had often proven themselves in combat before receiving commissions. The relationship between officers and men in the Rifles was less formal than in line regiments. Officers and soldiers called each other by name rather than just rank. This informality built cohesion and trust that paid dividends in combat. When an officer ordered his riflemen forward, they went because they trusted his judgment, not just because of his rank. Several famous riflemen rose from enlisted ranks to become officers and even generals. This social mobility was unusual in the British Army but common in the Rifles. It reinforced the meritocratic culture that made the regiment effective. The best soldiers advanced based on ability, creating a virtuous cycle where excellence was rewarded and mediocrity was winnowed out. The Battle of Salamanca in July 1812 demonstrated the full integration of rifles, light infantry, and line formations in Wellington's tactical system. The battle began with an extensive skirmish fight as both armies manoeuvred for position. Companies of the 95th and the light infantry battalions of the Light Division screened Wellington's movements, preventing French reconnaissance from determining British positions. When Marshal Marmont extended his line trying to outflank Wellington, rifle companies were the first to spot the gap that opened in the French formation. They sent word back rapidly, giving Wellington the intelligence he needed to launch his devastating counterattack. As British divisions wheeled and attacked the overextended French columns, riflemen protected their flanks and pursued broken French units. The victory at Salamanca, which Wellington called his finest battle, depended partly on the information provided by his light troops and their ability to screen his manoeuvres. The battle destroyed Marmont's army and opened the road to Madrid. French casualties were 14,000 to British 5,000. The lopsided ratio reflected superior British tactics and the effectiveness of their combined arms approach. After Salamanca, Wellington's army entered Madrid in triumph, the first time an Allied army had captured the Spanish capital since the French invasion. But the victory was incomplete. French armies still occupied much of Spain, and Wellington's supply lines were overstretched. He withdrew to Portugal for the winter, covered by his light infantry. The riflemen fought continuous rearguard actions, holding French pursuit at bay. These rearguard fights showcased defensive rifle tactics. Companies would position themselves at natural choke points like bridges, defiles, or river crossings. As French troops approached, riflemen would open fire at extreme range, killing officers and horses. When the French deployed skirmishers to drive them back, the riflemen would fall back to a second position already prepared. This tactic, called a fighting withdrawal, could delay a much larger force for hours. At the bridge over the Webra River in November 1812, 2 companies of the 95th held off an entire French division for 3 hours, buying time for the main army to cross safely. They fired over 4,000 rounds, inflicting hundreds of casualties while suffering only minor losses themselves. When French cavalry tried to force the crossing, aimed rifle fire brought down horses and riders, creating barriers of dead animals that blocked the bridge. The 1813 campaign saw Wellington take the offensive with an army that had been reinforced, resupplied, and refined into the best force Britain had ever fielded. The riflemen, now veterans of 5 years of campaigning, were at peak effectiveness. They knew every trick, every tactic, every way to kill French soldiers efficiently. The spring campaign began with a rapid advance that outflanked French defensive positions along the Douro River. Rifle companies scouted ahead, locating river crossings and probing French positions. When the army crossed, riflemen secured the far bank, creating bridgeheads that allowed the main force to deploy. The speed of Wellington's advance caught the French off balance. Marshal Jourdan, commanding French forces in northern Spain, was forced to retreat toward the Ebro River, abandoning supplies and equipment. Throughout the advance, rifle companies harassed French rearguards, inflicting casualties and disrupting their attempts to establish defensive positions. The culminating battle came at Vitoria in June 1813. Wellington's army, now numbering 78,000 British, Portuguese and Spanish troops, caught Jourdan's army of 65,000 in a valley with their backs to the mountains. The battle was a masterpiece of manoeuvre. Wellington attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, overwhelming French defensive positions through coordination and superior numbers. Rifle companies were everywhere. They climbed mountain paths to outflank French positions on the heights. They cleared French skirmishers from villages, fighting house to house with sword bayonets. They pursued broken French units through the baggage trains, capturing supplies and prisoners. French casualties were 8,000, but more importantly they lost all their artillery, most of their supplies, and the war chest containing 5 million francs. King Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother and puppet ruler of Spain, fled so quickly he left behind his personal belongings and extensive correspondence that revealed French strategic plans. Vitoria broke French power in Spain. The army retreated across the Pyrenees in disorder, abandoning their remaining Spanish positions. Wellington had won the Peninsula. The final campaigns of 1813 and 1814 involved pushing through the Pyrenees into southern France. The mountain fighting showcased riflemen in their ideal terrain. The narrow passes and steep slopes negated French numerical advantages, and gave defenders enormous advantages, but Wellington's riflemen could operate in mountains better than any troops in either army. They climbed goat paths to appear on French flanks. They established positions on peaks that dominated French valleys. They fought in weather that grounded other troops, knowing that movement meant survival in mountain warfare. The battles of the Pyrenees in July and August 1813 were a series of French attempts to break through Wellington's mountain positions and relieve besieged Pamplona. Marshal Soult, who had taken command of French forces after Vittoria, launched desperate attacks with 60,000 men against Wellington's 53,000 strung out along mountain ridges. The fighting was brutal and confused, with battles raging across multiple peaks simultaneously. Rifle companies fought at Sauron, Maya and Roncesvalles, holding critical positions that anchored British defences. At Sauron, riflemen positioned on a church tower provided aimed fire that broke up French attacks on the village below. Their elevated position gave them lines of sight across the battlefield, and they used it to devastating effect, killing French officers directing attacks and disrupting formations before they could coordinate assaults. The French attacks failed with heavy losses. Soult retreated back into France, his offensive power broken. Wellington's army followed, crossing into France in October 1813. For the first time since the Revolutionary Wars began in 1792, foreign troops were invading French soil. The psychological impact on French soldiers was significant. They were now fighting to defend their homes, which should have stiffened resistance. But 5 years of defeats in the peninsula had broken something in the French army in Spain. They fought, but without the confidence and aggression that had characterized French armies earlier in the wars. The rifle companies noticed this. French skirmishers were more cautious, less willing to press attacks. French columns hesitated when attacking British positions, their momentum faltering before contact. The cumulative effect of repeated defeats had eroded French tactical effectiveness to the point where Wellington's army, though fighting on French soil and at the end of extended supply lines, continued to dominate. The Battle of Nivelle in November 1813 saw Wellington attack prepared French defensive positions in the foothills of the Pyrenees. Soult had 35,000 men behind entrenchments that should have been nearly impregnable. Wellington attacked with 67,000 in a coordinated assault across a broad front. Rifle companies infiltrated French positions during the night before the battle, cutting through abatis and marking paths for the assault columns. When the attack began at dawn, British troops poured through gaps that riflemen had created, overwhelming French positions before they could fully man their defences. The technique of using light infantry to infiltrate enemy positions before a main assault was relatively novel. It required soldiers who could move silently, navigate in darkness, and fight independently if discovered. Riflemen were perfect for this role. At Nivelle, their night infiltration allowed Wellington to breach French defences with minimal casualties. The battle cost the French 4,600 casualties to British 2,700, and Soult was forced to retreat closer to Bayonne. The Battle of the Nive in December 1813 was fought in terrible weather, with rain and mud making movement difficult and visibility poor. The conditions favoured defenders, but Wellington continued attacking, knowing that keeping pressure on Soult prevented the French from reinforcing other theatres where Napoleon was facing Allied invasions of eastern France. Riflemen fought in conditions that would have paralysed less well-trained troops. They moved through forests in the rain, maintaining unit cohesion without being able to see more than 50 yards. They forded swollen rivers, holding their rifles and cartridge boxes above water to keep powder dry. They fought in mud that came up to their knees, firing from prone positions in freezing water. The fortitude required for this kind of warfare was extraordinary. These were soldiers who had been campaigning for years, who were tired, cold, and far from home, yet they continued to fight with skill and determination. The battles around Bayonne in February 1814 marked the end of organised resistance by Soult's army. Wellington besieged the fortress city while simultaneously defeating French attempts to break the siege. By this point, news had reached the peninsula that Paris had fallen to Allied armies, and Napoleon had abdicated. But communication was slow, and fighting continued for several more weeks. The final battle of the Peninsular War was fought at Toulouse in April 1814. Soult had withdrawn his army to the city and prepared strong defensive positions. Wellington attacked on April 10th with 49,000 men against Soult's 42,000. The battle was hard fought, with French troops defending their own soil with determination that had been lacking in Spain. But British tactical superiority remained decisive. Rifle companies cleared French skirmishers from the approaches, allowing British columns to assault the city's outer defences. The fighting was house to house in the suburbs, with riflemen using their shorter weapons to advantage in the confined spaces. British casualties were 4,600 to French 3,200, but Wellington's army forced the French from Toulouse and occupied the city. 2 days later, news arrived that Napoleon had abdicated on April 6th. The war was over. The rifle regiments had fought from Portugal to southern France, covering thousands of miles on foot, fighting hundreds of skirmishes and dozens of battles. They had lost heavily. The 95th Rifles suffered over 1,800 casualties during the Peninsular War, the highest casualty rate of any British regiment in the campaign. But they had also killed enemy soldiers at rates that no other unit matched. Gun camera technology didn't exist, but battalion returns and French casualty reports suggest that riflemen achieved kill ratios of 10 to 1 or better in skirmish actions. The strategic impact of British rifles extended beyond the peninsula. Other European armies studied British light infantry tactics and began forming their own rifle-armed units. The Prussians, who had fielded Jaeger units with rifles since the 1780s, expanded these formations and improved training based on British examples. The Austrians formed Tyrolean Jaeger battalions. Even the French, after 1815, reorganised their light infantry and issued rifles to elite companies. The Baker rifle itself influenced firearm design for decades. Its rifling system and robust construction informed later rifle designs. The British Army's decision to issue rifles to specialised light infantry, rather than trying to arm all infantry with rifles, became the standard model for other armies until breech-loading weapons made rifles practical for all infantry in the 1860s. The cultural impact on the British Army was equally significant. The rifle's emphasis on individual skill, merit-based promotion, and tactical flexibility challenged traditional British military culture that valued conformity and unquestioning obedience. The tension between these approaches lasted throughout the 19th century, but gradually the rifle's methods influenced broader army reforms. By the Crimean War in the 1850s, rifle-armed regiments were common in the British Army. By the Boer War in 1900, all British infantry carried rifles and used extended order tactics descended from Peninsular War light infantry doctrine. The green-jacketed riflemen of the 95th had changed how Britain thought about infantry warfare. The individual stories of riflemen in the Peninsular War reveal the human dimension behind the tactical statistics. These were men, mostly in their 20s, fighting in a foreign land for years at a time. They endured hardships that are difficult to comprehend from comfortable distance. They marched 20 miles a day carrying 60 pounds of equipment. They slept on the ground in rain and snow. They ate whatever food they could scavenge, often going hungry for days. They fought battles where death was random and sudden. They watched friends die from wounds, disease and exhaustion. Yet they maintained discipline, cohesion, and fighting effectiveness through 6 years of continuous campaigning. The memoirs and letters that survive from riflemen show intelligent, thoughtful men who understood what they were fighting for and took pride in their abilities. They weren't blindly obedient soldiers. They questioned orders they thought were foolish, though they usually obeyed anyway. They respected officers who led well and despised those who were incompetent or cowardly. They formed bonds with their comrades that lasted lifetimes. Many riflemen stayed in contact after the war, attending reunions and maintaining friendships forged in combat. The 95th developed a regimental identity that was stronger than most units. They were the green jackets, the sweeps, the chosen men. They knew they were elite, and that knowledge sustained them through hardships that broke lesser units. After Waterloo, when the 95th was renamed the Rifle Brigade and given precedence as the first rifle regiment in the British Army, veterans felt vindicated. They had proven that their methods worked. They had defeated the best army in Europe through skill, training, and superior weapons employed with intelligence and courage. The legacy of the Baker rifle and the men who carried it extends into modern times. The British Army's emphasis on marksmanship, which became a distinguishing characteristic in the 19th and 20th centuries, traces directly to Peninsular War rifle companies. The idea that individual soldiers should be trained to high standards and given initiative to think for themselves, now fundamental to Western military doctrine, was proven in the Peninsula by riflemen who operated independently in pairs and small groups. The principle that specialized troops with advanced training and equipment can achieve effects out of proportion to their numbers, now embodied in special operations forces worldwide, was demonstrated by rifle companies who routinely defeated much larger French formations. The technological lesson that investing in superior weapons and training soldiers to use them effectively provides advantages worth the cost has been validated repeatedly since the Peninsular War. From the American Civil War to Afghanistan, armies that prioritize marksmanship and individual soldier quality have consistently outperformed armies relying on mass and firepower volume. The Baker rifle was obsolete by 1840, replaced by percussion cap rifles and eventually breech loaders. But the principles it embodied remain relevant. Accuracy matters. Training matters. Individual soldier quality matters. These lessons, learned by green-jacketed riflemen in the mountains of Spain and Portugal, echo through military history. The French learned these lessons painfully. After 1815, French military theorists studied their defeats and concluded that their tactical doctrine had been flawed. The over-reliance on column attacks, the neglect of skirmisher training, the failure to develop rifle-armed light infantry, all were identified as critical mistakes. French military reforms after the Napoleonic Wars incorporated many British innovations, including increased emphasis on light infantry, better training for skirmishers, and eventually the adoption of rifles for all infantry. But these reforms came too late to save Napoleon's empire. The battles in the Peninsula, where British rifles and tactics had systematically dismantled French columns, had already demonstrated that the Napoleonic way of war was obsolete. Wellington understood this. He wrote after Waterloo that the French had never adapted to fighting British infantry. They persisted in using tactics that had worked against other armies, but failed against British firepower. This institutional rigidity cost France the Peninsula, and ultimately contributed to Napoleon's final defeat. The supreme irony of the Peninsular War is that France's defeats there were largely self-inflicted. French armies in Spain outnumbered British forces for most of the war. French soldiers were individually brave and often well led at the tactical level. But French doctrine was poorly suited to fighting an enemy who had solved the puzzle of defeating column attacks. Rather than adapting, French commanders kept trying the same tactics, expecting different results. This was institutional failure at the highest level. Napoleon, fighting in Central Europe, either didn't understand or didn't care about the reports from Spain describing British tactical superiority. When his marshals warned him that British infantry were different, that their firepower was devastating, that their skirmishers couldn't be beaten, he dismissed these warnings as excuses for failure. At Waterloo, when he finally faced Wellington directly, Napoleon attacked British positions using the same column tactics that had failed repeatedly in the Peninsula. He was convinced that French elan and determination would overcome British defensive tactics. He was wrong, catastrophically so. The Imperial Guard, attacking in column up the slope toward Wellington's Ridge, was shattered by British volleys exactly as French columns had been shattered at Vimeiro, Busaco, Salamanca, and a dozen other battles. Wellington, watching the Guard retreat in disorder, knew the battle was won. He had seen this before. British firepower, properly applied, was unstoppable by column attacks. Rifles alone didn't defeat France, but they were a crucial component of a tactical system that proved superior to Napoleonic doctrine. They gave British light infantry dominance in skirmishing that translated to intelligence advantages and psychological dominance. They killed French officers and NCOs at unprecedented rates, disrupting enemy command and control. They created casualty ratios that made every engagement disproportionately costly for France. Over 6 years and hundreds of battles, these advantages accumulated into strategic superiority that drove France from the Peninsula and contributed to Napoleon's ultimate defeat. The green-jacketed riflemen who climbed the mountains of Portugal, who fought through Spanish summers and Pyrenean winters, who killed French soldiers at ranges that seemed impossible, earned their place in military history. They were the right soldiers with the right weapons, led by competent officers and employed by a commander who understood how to use them. They proved that accuracy could defeat volume of fire, that individual skill could overcome numerical superiority, and that British infantry, properly trained and equipped, were the finest in the world. When the last shot of the Peninsular War was fired at Toulouse in April 1814, British rifles had shredded French columns so thoroughly that French tactical doctrine lay in ruins. The laughter of French officers who had mocked British soldiers in 1808 had long since died. In its place was respect tinged with fear for the green-jacketed riflemen who had rewritten the rules of infantry warfare one accurate shot at a time.